Well, question, do you have a compelling vision for your life? What I mean is your life about more than just paying the bills, try to set aside a little for retirement and survive? I think many of us, if we were really honest, do I have a compelling vision for my life? Many of us, that's it, to survive, to make it. I want to ask you another question. Consider it a hypothetical question. What if there were one singular movement, a vision so big and so noble and so actionable that this movement has eradicated disease, that this movement has abolished slavery, that this movement has established literacy and modern education? If there were one singular movement that had done those things in world history, would you want to be part of such a movement? You know, secular psychologists, non-Christian psychologists tell us that the most fulfilling life is a life that has a vision or a purpose greater than itself. And you see this often in Silicon Valley. Take, for example, the founders of Google. They have this vision statement that it's more than to just make money. This vision that all the information in the world would be searchable. And when you latch onto a vision like that, there's a fulfillment, there's a joy, there's a purpose and a significance. Do you have such a vision in your life? Sometimes you'll see companies here in Silicon Valley, well, they'll start with a purpose like that. Some big vision that's way bigger than making money. And then after they go public and they have shareholders, slowly the vision kind of turns into, we need to be turning a profit every quarter and making the shareholders happy. And maybe some of you have worked at companies like that where it's like, man, it used to be a vision, it used to be awesome, and now it's just a job. Now it's just to make money. Is your life just a job? Is your life just surviving? Or do you have a compelling vision that you're part of? Well, in this series, Why I Believe, we've been looking at the truth about Jesus and the history of true Christ followers. Not churches and denominations, but individuals who are truly passionate about following Jesus. And we've been seeing from firsthand historic records, primary sources, that Christ followers have been part of an incredible movement. I want to share with you part of the vision today. It's what Jesus said at the very beginning of his public ministry. He was about 30 years old. And here's what Jesus said. It's recorded in Luke chapter 4. He said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring" what? Good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that the captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free. Now, here's the incredible thing. At this time in world history, dominant leaders didn't pay a lot of attention to the poor and the blind, the captives, and the oppressed. At this time in world history, slavery was a global norm on every continent. At this time in world history, most people didn't have personal property rights. Most people were illiterate. And the ruling class in multiple civilizations around the world would essentially use everyone else to make themselves more rich. And most of the influential people got there not by caring about the poor and the blind and the captives and the oppressed. This was a really unique vision. It's definitely a noble vision. At the time, it might have seemed like an impossible vision. How's this one prophet who doesn't own any land, doesn't have an army, how is he going to give any kind of good news to the poor? How is he going to set free those who are oppressed? How is he going to give sight to the blind? As you follow Jesus' teaching through the Gospels, and in this series, we've talked about the historicity of those ancient accounts. If you missed that week, it's a great one to review. We know where these ancient documents came from, and that they do record what Jesus and his followers experienced in the first century. As Jesus' ministry continued, it became evident that there was an intentional double meaning to this vision. You see, the vision is twofold. One, it's for our internal persons, our inner hearts. Jesus would teach that essentially all of us are held captive by desires that work against us, habits and thought patterns that aren't in the best interest of our neighbors. And so Jesus' vision, it's for inside of us, but then it's this: those who trust in Jesus get transformed, and he will use them to be a force for good in human history. I've shared in previous weeks about my background as an investigative reporter and how skeptical I am by nature and skeptical I was about Christianity, especially in the generation that many of us have been raised in. Seems like anytime Christianity comes up in one of our textbooks, it's in a negative light. And yet when I started to investigate for myself, first the teachings of Jesus, but then also what Jesus' followers have done throughout history, I came to this conclusion. After a careful examination of primary evidence, and we talked about the importance of primary evidence. You can find 5 historians who say Christianity has been a force for good, and you can find 5 who say Christianity has been a force for evil. What you can do for yourself as a reading and thinking person is you can look for yourself at Isaac Newton's writings. Isaac Newton, who's undeniably one of the fathers of the scientific revolution, undeniably one of the most influential scientists in world history. And you can read for yourself. You don't have to take my opinion or anyone else's about whether Isaac Newton was a Christ follower. And we saw last week that Isaac Newton, he actually wrote more words of theology than he did of physics, even though his physics has transformed the world and unlocked many of the secrets of the universe. So through primary evidence, I personally have become convinced that Christianity, and by this I mean the true Christ followers, we talked about this pattern that when Christian movements start, they're usually helping the poor, helping the sick, and people are attracted to it, and it grows. And as it grows, it accumulates money and buildings and sometimes political power. And then after a while, corrupt people are drawn to the powerful positions in Christianity for the wrong reasons. And so as a result, Jesus predicted, he said, there will always be 2 kinds of Christians among you. He called them wheats and tares. He said there's always going to be the pure-hearted ones who are really my followers, and there's always going to be some corrupt ones. In fact, in Jesus' first 12 disciples, there was one of those corrupt ones, a guy named Judas, who was actually traveling around with Jesus and the disciples so he could reach his hand into the bag of money for all the poor people and take some for himself. So while the movement is far from spotless because of many Judases, the reality is that we can trace sincere Christ followers, and we find that they are a force for perpetual human good in human history. And last week we started looking at some of these areas that have been planted by Christ followers. And I want to give you an example. The house that my family's renting, in our backyard, we have an orange tree and a lemon tree. And it's so much fun. I'm loving living in California. I'll often take my 4-year-old daughter out in the back and we'll pick some oranges or some lemons. Then we'll go straight into the kitchen and we'll slice them up and we'll press them and we'll make lemonade and orange juice, usually with a lot of sugar. And it's so fun. We love eating this fruit. But here's the thing. I have no idea who planted those trees. I have no idea who toiled or labored somewhere in history to open up the ground, to put a seedling in there, and then to water it and take care of it. I'm enjoying the fruit, but I didn't do the work. The reality is that we live in a society in human history where we are in a grove of fruit trees. We have rights of property, literacy, even the right to have a say in how our government functions. Women's rights, we're not there yet, but we are way further along than other societies in human history. The fact that we don't live wondering, is an epidemic, is a disease gonna sweep through and wipe out half the population? That was the norm in human history. Things like smallpox and the Black Plague and polio would commonly just wipe out half of entire civilizations. This is how people lived, and famines were common. And so I want you to think of the top of this as the last 5,000 years of human history. The reality is that there's fruit we enjoy in our lives, freedom, education, prosperity, which we think is normal because it's been normal to us, but it has only been normal for this very edge of human history. In the last 5,000 years, it's just been in the last 150, maybe 200 years that we've had things like vaccines, literacy for an entire nation, freedom from slavery, women's rights, which are progressing. And so the question is, who planted these trees? The question is, like a family tree, can we trace this fruit that we enjoy back down to its root, and can we discover who planted those seeds? And that's what we started doing last week. We saw undeniably 2 seedlings that were planted that have grown up and we enjoy the fruit from. Last week we saw higher education, that there's this, it's traceable by fact and by primary source. That Harvard was started by the Reverend John Harvard, along with others who started it as a Bible seminary to teach young people to read the Bible. We saw that those same Puritans enacted the first law of its kind in the world, that any village with 100 people had to teach the children to read. That was new. And we traced, first of all, we saw that all our other universities in the U.S. have come from Harvard and Yale. Yale was started by 10 pastors. And then we traced back and we saw that they came from Cambridge and from Oxford in 1096. And we saw even earlier these cathedral schools, Christian cathedral schools, as undeniably the seed from which we now enjoy the fruit. We also saw in the scientific revolution, and all of this was footnoted. If you look up last week's message online, you can get the notes, you can get the sources, the primary sources for yourself. We looked at a sociologist who surveyed the primary writings of the 52 key scientists during the scientific revolution and concluded that 60% of them were devout Christians and another 38% of them were active Christians, 2% were non-Christians. And we saw direct writings from Isaac Newton, Blaise Pascal, Johannes Kepler, that these men were not incidental geniuses who happened to be Christians, that these men saw a reality of a good God who orders a universe, and that's why we can look for order in the laws of physics. And we saw that their Christianity did indeed plant the seedling of the scientific revolution. And so today I'd like to cover with you 2 more of these seedlings which have grown up and we now enjoy the fruit from. Whether you believe that Jesus was God or not, whether you're a Christian or not, we're going to see undeniable facts that the people who planted these trees that we benefit from, they were motivated by the vision that Jesus cast in Luke chapter 4. The vision that the poor would have good news. The vision that the captives would be set free and that the blind would see. So the first seedling we're going to look at today is that of modern hospitals and institutional philanthropy. Devout Christians, those who at times when churches get corrupt, there's always groups that pop out the side and say, no, we're going to be serious about following Jesus. We're not being Christians because it's convenient. We want to follow Jesus. In every generation, there's those groups. And those kind of Christians, motivated by sincere Christ belief, they played an irrefutable role, an inextricable role, an inseparable role in establishing the hospitals that we now enjoy and institutional philanthropy. As early as the 2nd century, historians start documenting that these weirdo Christians, these followers of Jesus and followers of the way, were always caring for the orphans and the widows, always caring for the poor. And again, this was not the norm in history. And as early as the 2nd century, we get historians writing about pagans throwing their babies in the river because they don't want them, and the Christians going in with fishing nets and fishing the babies out and then raising the babies as their own. Here's some medieval art that shows an early Christian hospital. Well, what these hospitals were, of course, they were crude by our scientific standards today, but they were places where anyone who was sick or poor or hungry could come. And the symbolism of this picture, the symbolism is here's a person who's wounded, and what's happening? The Christian is washing his feet. You see, on the night before Jesus was crucified, his final dramatic act with his disciples was that he knelt down and he washed their feet. Those sandaled feet, which would have had manure and all sorts of dirt on them from walking in an arid, ancient Near Eastern climate. And Jesus knelt down and did what a servant would do. And he washed, 120 toes that night, including Judas's toes. And he said in the midst of it, if I, your Lord and Master, wash your feet, so you should go and do the same. He said, to be great in my kingdom, to be part of my vision for humanity, what greatness is it's serving the least of these. And it's physically helping those who need help. It was a revolutionary vision. We've inherited a society where it's assumed that we all want to help the poor, but that has not been the norm in human history. Jesus cast that vision. The early church started to live out that vision. Now, where do hospitals come from? Well, there's a medical historian who lives here in the Bay Area. He's a professor at University of California, San Francisco. And here's what he writes about the beginnings of hospitals. He's talking about 499 AD or Common Era, and he's talking about the Christians. He says, joining this religion, the Christians, ensured membership in a dedicated network of believers whose family values protected orphans and widows, and whose nursing services were eagerly sought. You see, there weren't formal nursing services, but the Christians had experience. And so when there were earthquakes or fires or epidemics, people would go to the Christians because the Christians were used to taking care of the sick and the hungry. Christianity became the basis for a new social solidarity. Do you get what's happening? There's a movement that's happening. The vision is becoming reality. And here's the result: the institutionalization of philanthropy. In other words, there's not just a few people in a village who care about the poor, but a movement of let's all care for the poor. And with it, the creation of establishments to shelter these different groups of people. The poor, to care for the sick, to assist widows and the aged, and to raise orphans. The mutual love between God and humans was distinct to Christian dogma, and it energized all actions aimed at assisting others. To this day, if you go to societies where Christianity is outlawed, you will find that the care for the orphans, for the widows, and the elderly, and even women's rights in general, are at a standard that we would all consider inhumane, because we have inherited what started with the Christ followers. And this movement, documented by this medical historian who says this is where hospitals began, it continued in cathedral hospitals all throughout the Middle Ages. And here's what we see by the time it gets to the scientific revolution, because the scientific revolution incidentally is also coming from these Christian schools like Oxford and Cambridge. You've now got science right next door to these crude hospitals, and the two start to intermingle. And so as a result, you get people like Edward Jenner. Let's look at a picture of Edward Jenner. Edward Jenner is the father of immunology. To put this into perspective, in the 100 years before Edward Jenner discovered and invented the first vaccine, in the 100 years before, 400 million people had died from smallpox. Now, there's 320 million people in the U.S. right now. So it gives you a feel for all through human history, at any time, an epidemic could come and wipe out half your family, half your community. Edward Jenner, to this day, scientists marvel at how he created the first vaccine. There was a leap. The science was this far, and somehow he just thought he would experiment, and somehow he created the first vaccine. I mean, this is before, plastic and modern hypodermic needles. And I mean, he invents the first vaccine using glass and handmade instruments. Starts to vaccinate the public from smallpox. And it becomes evident within his life that his discovery is saving the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. In fact, there's a calculator online that adds up, and it's always counting. This is from about a week ago, the number of people whose lives Edward Jenner has saved. It's presently 550 million. That would be, if you added up every person in the United States right now, man, woman, child, and every person in Russia, it would not be quite this many people. That's how many people have been saved by Edward Jenner. In fact, one group of historians concludes that his work has saved more lives than the work of any other human. The point is, Edward Jenner laid a foundational block in modern medicine. If we didn't have immunology and vaccines, do you realize we are one of the first generations? We don't worry about dying from polio or meningitis or hepatitis B or smallpox or the Black Plague. We don't worry about that. It's because of Edward Jenner. And here's what Jenner, who was a devoted Christ follower, who read his Bible regularly, here's what he said toward the end of his life. I'm not surprised that men are not grateful to me, but I wonder that they are not grateful to God for the good which he has made me the instrument of conveying to my fellow creatures. You see, Edward Jenner's mentality, and we saw this with Newton and Kepler and Blaise Pascal, it was not, I'm a really smart, gifted person who happens to be a Christian. It was, I am a follower of Christ. I am a tool in the hands of God. And as I follow Christ with my gifts to help the poor and the sick, God will use me as an instrument to convey his good to my fellow creatures. This is how Jenner thought, and Jenner is one of dozens who have laid the blocks of modern medicine. Here's another. Her name is Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale is the mother of modern nursing, but way more than just nursing, she also created the layout, the modern layout of hospitals. And she did this by using charts. We see here one of her hand-drawn charts. This is a mortality chart. This was a first. No one else in the history of humanity had tracked the data of causes of death among various populations. And as Florence did this one's actually within a battle, but she did this in hospitals, and it's why she started to create different wards, because she would start to track, these people got sick at this time, it took this long. Statistical data in medicine started with Florence Nightingale. Here's what Florence Nightingale, who was a sincere Christian, wrote in one of her books called Suggestions for Thought. Again, this is primary evidence. These are her words that she wrote. Christ indeed came into the world to save sinners, to wash them with his blood, to deliver men from sin and its consequences, which is death and sickness, to establish the kingdom of heaven with him. You see what Florence is saying? Her whole life, she was motivated by this twofold. Jesus came to change us within and then use us who are changed to make the world a better place. This is a real vision that has really happened. Next, I want to show you a picture of Johns Hopkins Hospital now. And you've probably heard of Johns Hopkins because it's a leading hospital when it comes to medical research. Johns Hopkins was started by a gentleman named Johns Hopkins. And Johns Hopkins was raised as a Quaker. That's a sect of Christianity that was really popular in the United States. And as a Quaker, this is interesting. One day, John's parents were at church. And this is before the abolition of slavery. And the Quakers together opened their Bibles, and together they concluded as a group that slavery was morally wrong because of what Jesus says, and that he came to set the captives free. And so they all decided we're all going to free our slaves. This was a big economic decision for them at the time. Well, John's was a teenager at this time. His dad came home and said, son, to follow Jesus, we got to let go of all our slaves. We need to let them be free. And so now John's and his brothers had to start harvesting in the fields where they weren't working, they were in school. John's, as a result, never finished his education. And he became very successful in business, just as a natural-born entrepreneur. At the end of his life, he was unmarried, he didn't have children, and as a follower of Christ, he thought, what do I want my life to be about? And he thought, I want to help the former slaves, I want to help the sick, and I want to educate those who can't afford to be educated. And so in his will, he split his fortune, first to be put into an orphanage for African American orphans, black orphans. Second, he said that the rest of my estate should be split to create two institutions, a hospital and a university. And he wrote in his will the vision for the first ever research hospital, a hospital that would work with a university to do research in science and medicine. Here's the motto of Johns Hopkins University. It's a verse that Jesus said, "The truth will set you free." And that doesn't surprise you if you were here last week learning about Harvard and Yale's foundings or Cambridge and Oxford's. You can see two Bibles here. Johns Hopkins was created by a Christian to help the poor, to help the sick, and to educate the masses. Today, I've got a picture of Johns for you guys, just so you guys can see him, right? Good-looking guy, huh? He had a good heart, okay? And Johns Hopkins, to this day, you want to talk about contributions to modern medicine, things like residents, things like house staff, things like medical staff having rounds, those all came from Johns Hopkins Hospital. The whole idea of research hospitals, where there is academic research going on simultaneously with the care of patients, it started at Johns Hopkins. Anyone will tell you who's in the medical industry and knows medical history that Johns Hopkins is undeniably a seed in the ground from which modern hospitals have grown. Well, I could go on and on just within medicine, but let's move quickly to institutional philanthropy. And we don't have time to develop this, but I'll show you just 3 philanthropic organizations that you're probably familiar with. The Salvation Army, which was started by the Reverend William Booth and his wife Catherine. The Goodwill, which was started by the Reverend Edgar J. Helms to help the poor, also to help the poor. And then the YMCA, which was started by a sincere Christ follower named George Williams. Of course, the Y originally meant the Young Men's Christian Association. You see, what happened was during the Industrial Revolution, young men were moving to these urban areas for factory jobs. And these young men were flooding these cities, and they were starting to make money, but they didn't really have a moral compass. So as a result, around the factories, just all sorts of brothels and gambling houses are going up. And George Williams had this vision that the young men should have a place where they can physically work out, and then they can study the Bible, and they can learn to be free-thinking people who understand the teachings of Jesus and hopefully live a moral life in line with Jesus. That's where the YMCA came from. Remember what that medical historian said back from 499 Common Era? He said that this was the beginning not only of hospitals, but institutional philanthropy. That is a society where as a whole, the poor are cared for, and the homeless are cared for, and the orphans are cared for. Well, there's another tree that we enjoy the fruit from, and we can trace down to the roots to see who planted it. And that's the tree of the abolition of slavery. The abolition of slavery, which, especially if you're from my generation, you've probably heard in some history classes the very opposite of what we're about to see. But what we're going to see, again, is from primary sources. And on your notes, that whole right page is primary sources that you can look up for yourself. And especially on this issue, I would encourage you, if you don't believe it, to read for yourself the literature which changed the national mood about slavery, and you will find over and over and over again that the entire argument of why slavery is wrong is from the Bible. I mean, overtly so. You'll find things like why God is against slavery according to the Greek and Hebrew scriptures. I mean, these are long, in-depth arguments that are all coming out of the scripture. Now, let's just say up front that slavery flies in the face of God's nature. God created humankind in his image. He desires for us to be free. And so the buying and selling of people clearly contradicts God's nature as revealed in Scripture, clearly contradicts Christianity. Unfortunately, there's confusion on this because in time there became some people who were cultural Christians. That is, they weren't really Jesus followers because their parents and grandparents had been Christians. They said, yeah, I'm a Christian. And some of those people had slaves. And so we, in our society, tend to think of that as the beginning of slavery. And again, that was a horrific wrong. It was morally wrong. It contradicted what Jesus taught. And it was the true Jesus followers we're going to see who said, no, we can't have slaves if we're going to be following Jesus. But first of all, we need to get a context of slavery in the world. And I've put in your notes about 6 sources that will give you an overview, if you're curious, about the history of slavery in the world. But here's a summary of it from the Oxford University Press. Oxford University Press says this: in the ancient Near East, as in Asia, Europe, Africa, and the pre-conquest Americas, North America, South America, and Central America, various forms of slavery and servitude almost certainly emerged long before they were systematized by laws or legal codes. What's the point? The point is, if you study the archaeological evidence, you will find that slavery was a human norm on every continent of the world, in every major civilization. Remember how we talked about if you go back 5,000 years, all the way up to about here. Okay, when did slavery start to be eradicated? Well, the beginning of it, according to historian Glenn Sunshine, is this: Christians were the first people in history to oppose slavery, to oppose it systematically. Glenn Sunshine wrote this in a book called Why You Think the Way You Do. He's a PhD researcher. And here's what he says. Early Christians, he's talking 3rd and 4th century, would purchase slaves in the market simply to set them free. Later in the 7th century, the Franks, that's France, the Franks became the first kingdom to, as a kingdom, outlaw slavery, begin the process of it. By the Central Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had all but abolished slavery in Western Europe. So by the Middle Ages, it's mostly out of Europe where the church is strong, and we're going to see this church struggle with maintaining its purity, and different groups shoot off to try to reestablish a pure-hearted following of Jesus. But the point is, slavery at this time was still the norm in India, in China, even in North America. You've heard of Sacagawea, perhaps? Sacagawea is a Native American. You might not have known she was a slave of another Native American tribe. So the question is not, has there ever been someone who claimed to be a Christian who owned a slave? The answer to that question is people of every civilization that's a major civilization own slaves. Here's the question I would ask. What civilization overturned slavery? What civilization was able to uproot the weed of slavery and in its place plant a tree of freedom? And that path is traceable. It's traceable in European history. Now, by the time the colonial era started, slavery was not in Western Europe. But what happened when the colonies started to get established is you had 2 different kinds of people who were coming to this new world. We talked last week about the Puritans who started Harvard, and they came out of a purity that they wanted to create a new religious movement of following Jesus with a separation of church and state, okay? That's what they wanted, but there were other people. There were opportunists who saw a new world as an opportunity to own a bunch of land, make a bunch of money, own plantations, sell crops, and get rich. Those opportunists reinvigorated slavery. There were still slave traders in Africa and in all the Muslim countries. And so these European colonials who couldn't buy slaves in Europe started opportunistically buying slaves and taking them to the colonies, where a lot of the Europeans didn't fully know what was going on. And as they did that and started to populate the colonies with slaves, this weed of slavery, because I mean, what is slavery? It's the kidnapping of people. It's buying and selling people. It's often murdering people. It is morally reprehensible. It's corrupt. It's wrong. And these greedy people start doing this off where much of society can't see it. And then by the time Europe is fully aware of slavery, it's almost too late to stop it. And so how did it get stopped? How did it ever get uprooted? Well, here's what's great about history. You can look for yourself and see. And you'll see that this gentleman, William Wilberforce, is kind of he led the charge of abolition in the United Kingdom. Now, here's what you should know about William Wilberforce. He was not a humanitarian. He was not a good person. He didn't care about slaves. And then he became a Christian. And as a Christian, he started to read the New Testament. And he started to read the teachings of Jesus. And you can read primary source evidence from William Wilberforce. He wrote a book. It's called Real Christianity. You can get it yourself. You can probably read it on Google Books today if you wanted. And you can read his story of realizing that he was a sinner and he needed God, and then his eyes being opened up, and then realizing, what is humanity doing? And he gave the rest of his life, him and a few other devoted Christ followers, to end slavery in the United Kingdoms. And when the United Kingdoms outlawed slavery, Britain at the time had a large empire around the world. So this was before the Civil War in North America and the United States. And so slavery became outlawed not only in the United Kingdoms, but in India, which was a British territory. It was formerly outlawed. In Canada, in Australia, this gentleman and his movement of Christ followers, now at this time, there's no slaves in Europe now. Slavery is formally outlawed in all the British colonies, which is a big footprint at the time. There's still slavery at this time in history in the Middle East. There's still slavery at this time in history in Africa. And sadly, there's still slavery at this time in the United States. So how did slavery ever get uprooted here in the United States? Well, there's a group called the Anti-Slavery Society. And what's great is they kept records. And you can look and see the anti-slavery activists, called abolitionists, and you can read about each of their lives for yourself. And you will find, if you will look for yourself, that overwhelmingly, in fact, I have yet to find one who is not a devoted Christian. Christians who are reading the Bible and saying, slavery is wrong. And any of you who say you're a Christian and you have a slave, or you even sit by while your neighbor has a slave, you're not truly a follower of Christ. That's what these guys were writing. Samuel Sewall, William Wilberforce in England, Frederick Douglass later here in the United States. The real movement of the abolition as it began to gain momentum was led undeniably by a guy named William Lloyd Garrison. Here's William Lloyd Garrison's picture. And like most of the other abolitionists, he was changing the whole country's view of slavery by writing. And again, it's a literate nation, so they can read, and these arguments are out of Scripture, which many of them respected at the time. And it's saying over and over again, a true Christ-following people cannot have slaves. Let's look at the masthead of William Lloyd Garrison's publication. It's called The Liberator. And I want to zoom in and show you a couple things here. First, there's this ribbon along the bottom, and it says, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." That's Jesus. That's a Jesus quote. Okay, the whole point of this movement was, if we are really going to follow Jesus and love our neighbors as ourselves, we cannot tolerate slavery in our land. Here's another. On this coin, it says, "I come to break the bonds of the oppressor." That is the actual vision that we read in Luke chapter 4 that Jesus gave to say, this is what my movement is going to be about. And as these kind of publications spread around the country, this is generations before the Civil War, it started planting in the conscience and in the mind of the American people, if we want to be, any of you who want to be serious about following Christ, we have to overturn slavery. Well, William Lloyd Garrison credits one book for influencing him more than any other book. It's called Letters on Slavery, and it's written by one of my personal heroes, the Reverend John Rankin. We've got a picture of John Rankin here. Actually, this picture hangs in my office because this guy is an inspiration to me. Because he changed the national mood through his writing, which came from Scripture, but he was more than just a writer and a pastor. He was an activist. You see, Rankin's journey with slavery started when he first became a pastor. He got assigned to a church in the South. And one day as he was studying for his message, he realized slavery is morally wrong according to this book. So he got up in front of his church and he said, if you all really want to follow Jesus, you all need to free your slaves. Well, at this time in the South, that particular church said, then we don't want to follow Jesus. We would rather get fat and use people and only use Christianity if it's convenient for us. We don't actually want to follow Jesus. And so they fired him. They actually ran him out of town. John Rankin escaped to the north, and he set up shop along the Ohio River. Now, this is interesting, okay? The Ohio River runs east to west. North is Ohio, which is a free state. South is Kentucky, which was a slave state. As slaves were escaping to the north, because Canada is free, right, because of William Wilberforce, as slaves are escaping to the north, if they can cross the Ohio River, they're into free territory. So what John Rankin did is he intentionally bought a house on the Ohio River. It's still there. It's in a town called Ripley, Ohio. And he started what we know as the Underground Railroad. He started his installation of it. And we've got a picture here of John Rankin's window. You can go visit this, okay? This is John Rankin's window. This is the Ohio River. That's Kentucky. That's slave territory. This is free territory. This lamp was significant, this gas lamp. Because with the Underground Railroad, John Rankin had this code that he would do with the number of times he would blink the lamp. And the slaves who were escaping from Kentucky would see this blinking, and based on how it blinked, they would know if it was safe to cross the river or not. They would cross the river, and you can actually see the path going down here where John Rankin would meet them and then hide them in his house. This was so controversial at the time that multiple times Southerners came and crossed the river and burned down John Rankin's house and his barn. And yet, as an activist motivated by his Christian beliefs, he continued to harbor free slaves and to help them escape to the north. There's actually a story, a true story of a time that John Rankin looked out this window, and it was winter time. And the river was mostly iced over, but the ice was starting to break. And he saw a slave woman running across the river barefoot on the breaking ice, holding a child as she crossed the river. Rankin told this true story to a friend of his named Harriet Beecher Stowe. And Harriet Beecher Stowe took that scene and wrote it into a book that maybe you've heard of called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin, actually that's a picture of Eliza right there crossing the river, and it's a true story. You can look it up that John Rankin told this to Harriet Beecher Stowe. This book, which if you're older than 45, you've probably read for yourself. If you're younger than 45, you've probably heard someone's opinion about it. But the book turned the national tide in the United States of the view on slavery. And it did so by this. It set up these Christian characters, and there's this key moment in the book where they're literally looking in the Bible at Matthew chapter 25. And Jesus, when everyone comes to heaven at the end of their lives, he says, you're in heaven, you're not in heaven. You're in, you're not. And he says, here's why you're in. Because you cared for the least of these, and when you did that, you cared for me. Here's why you're not in. You were religious, but you never cared for the least of these, and so you didn't care for me, so you're not part of my kingdom. And Harriet Beecher Stowe essentially threw down the gauntlet and said, if you don't care for the least of these, as in you might not have slaves, but you know there's slavery going on in the country, then expect that when you stand before Jesus, you're not going to go into his kingdom. And it literally shook the nation awake. I mentioned before, perhaps 75% of the local agents for the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1834, you can look this up. You can look up the American Anti-Slavery Society. You'll find that 3 out of 4 of the agents who were going around stirring up the populace to uproot slavery, 3/4 of them were pastors and clergy. And if you look at the lives of the other quarter of them, they were devout Christians as well. Well, let's move now to 2 of my favorite abolitionists, and the first is Harriet Tubman. And let's give a round of applause to Harriet because she just got on the $20 bill. Can we celebrate that? Yeah. And this is cool because I'm not too into politics, but I am into Jesus' kingdom, and Harriet's part of Jesus' kingdom, and I get really excited about that. And Harriet Tubman, if you look at primary source documents of her life, was a devoted Jesus follower. She was the kind who was always talking to Jesus. Actually, here's what's incredible about Harriet. She was often called Moses because after she escaped from slavery herself, she had every right. She could have just run as far north as she could get and set up a new life for herself. Instead, she would go on these raids down into the South to free other slaves. That's why she was called Moses, like Moses freeing God's people from slavery in the book of Exodus in the Bible. And there are story after story of Harriet Tubman as she's running away and they're being chased, often talking to Jesus and saying, Lord, do we cross this river or do we take that path? Lord, do we go up that hill or do we hide in this barn? And she's just constantly talking to Jesus, just devoted Jesus follower. And she's not the only former slave who became an abolitionist who was a dedicated Jesus follower. There are dozens of them. We'll look at one more. His name is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was an incredibly eloquent orator and writer. And that happened because when he converted to Christianity, he started reading the Bible, studying the Bible, and writing. And Frederick Douglass, similar to Harriet Tubman, had escaped from slavery himself, had every right to just spend the rest of his life as an angry, bitter person about the injustices that were done to him. But instead, he was able to funnel all of that righteous anger into a cause for good, as he went around the country speaking in the North primarily to largely white audiences about the horrors of slavery. Oftentimes when Frederick Douglass was speaking, mercenaries would show up or Southerners would come and try to burn down the hall that he was speaking in. And yet he continued to just eloquently lay out the biblical case of why slavery is morally wrong and to stir up a nation against it. Here's what Frederick Douglass writes. If you've never read any of his biographies, he's got 3 autobiographies that he wrote, and you can read them for yourself. And he's a great writer. He's talking here about when he was still a slave and he became a Christian. He says, "In my loneliness and destitution, I longed for someone to whom I could go as to a father and protector. The preaching of a white Methodist minister named Hanson was the means of causing me to feel that in God I had such a friend." And he continues and he says this, "He thought that all men, great and small, bond and free, were sinners in the sight of God." See, this is one of the differences between just a humanitarian, which we now have after Christianity, and a true Christian activist. A Christian activist says it's not that people are all good by nature. It's that people are all broken by nature and Jesus can fix us. And so because of that, he understands everyone is rebelling against God's way. And they must repent of their sins and be reconciled to God through Christ. Douglass continues and he says this, after he makes that decision, he says, "I finally found my burden lightened and my heart relieved. I loved all mankind, slaveholders not accepted." That's not normal, right? "Though I abhorred slavery more than ever." There was this righteous sense of slavery is even more evil now that I understand God's plan for people, but I will love all my neighbors. I saw the world in a new light. And he says this, my great concern was to have everybody converted. Everyone needs to experience what I experienced with Jesus. It changed me so much from the inside out. My desire to learn increased, and especially did I want a thorough acquaintance with the contents of the Bible. Frederick Douglass, incredible, probably the most influential African American of his century. What's the point? If you remove these sincere Christ followers from world history, you get a very different world than the one that we were born into. And so the challenge, if you're here and you're still a skeptic, is this. Do you know of any other vision that is this noble, that is this proven, that has this long of a track record? Is there any other vision that has done so much good for humanity? And for those of us who believe, here's the question, will we carry the vision like Frederick Douglass and like John Rankin and like Florence Nightingale? Will we be unafraid to smell the smells of poverty and to put our hands in the wounds of those who are bleeding and because we love them because of what Jesus called us to do? In other words, Are we going to be those so-called Christians who only use Christianity if it's convenient for us? Or are we going to be the true Christ followers in our generation who say that no matter the cost, no matter if I get fired, no matter if my house gets burned down, I will follow Jesus because this vision for humanity is the most inspiring vision for all of humanity. I want to close by just telling you a story about a brother in our congregation who's from India. And as I was coming out to preach, I said, pray for me because this is a really controversial issue. He said, John, I have to encourage you before you go out. He said, my grandmother in India was practically a slave. In India, there's a caste system. She was the lowest caste. She cleaned people's front walkways. She took out their trash. She was pretty much a slave. He said, Christian missionaries, pure-hearted Christians came to our village. And when they explained the message of Christ, it completely changed our way of life. And it's because of those Christians and the school they started and how they did away with the class system that I was educated to know how to read. He said, I'm the first generation immigrant in the United States. I'm an engineer, and it's because of the pure-hearted Christ followers that you're talking about. So the question for us is, are we going to go out and continue that for our generation?